Okay, so in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at if the changes have been progressive. There's definitely some groups we could look at that we could say that change has been progressive for, and then there's also definitely some obvious groups that change hasn't been that progressive. So since the removal of the Taliban government from Afghanistan in 2001, it's easy to assume that all change has been progressive. Progressive change means that the change has led to greater quality of life for the majority of people. However, for the most part, you would be right to assume that change has been progressive. The bringing in of a democratic government has provided women and youth with a voice and empowerment that was not available to them under the Taliban. However, even with those changes, not all have been able to access those changes, and some people have even lost some of their rights or powers with bringing in of those changes. So we can't say that change has been progressive for all. So women, has change been beneficial for them? So yes, we could say in terms of education, change has been beneficial or progressive, and this can be seen through the access to education and work increasing. As we know, 40% of girls attend primary school and 50% of university lecturers are women. We can also see that there's greater rights with the bringing about of this democratic government. So women are now allowed to sit in the government, and as we know, there's 27% seats currently held by women, which is exceeding the 25% quota established in the constitution after the getting rid of the Taliban in 2001. Also, the 2009 EVAW law, which is the elimination of violence against women, that was brought in, which criminalises child marriage, rape, and other forms of violence. So all of that definitely demonstrates that there has been beneficial change for women. And we can also see improved health for women as well since these changes have come in and since the new government has come in. And this can be seen through the death in labour decreasing from 1,500 per 100,000 births in 2002 to 327 in 2010. So that's a significant decrease. And so we can definitely say that's been beneficial for both mothers and children. And also access to contraception has also increased from just 5% of the rural population having access in 2003 to 20% in 2011, and fertility rates have decreased from 7 in 2002 to 5.14 in 2012. These are really, really important stats that you need to try to remember, especially when talking about progressive change, as all of that added together provides women, well, families as well, with greater health statistics, but also provides women with greater control over their lives as they're now able to control their family sizes a little more. It also gives them greater opportunities to partake in the meso world in the workforce. However, this is where it comes into a questioning of whether or not all these changes can be seen as progressive for women. As, like I said before, lack of access to change is really impacting on its beneficial impacts. A 2013 UN report showed that there has been a 28% increase in domestic violence across Afghanistan. Now, this can kind of be explained through a little bit through the introduction of the EVAW in 2009, and that's because more women are reporting domestic violence now. So you could say that increase is just because more women are reporting. However, there's also evidence to say that there is an increase in domestic violence. In 2012 to 2013, there were 650 incidents of violence reported alone, but only 109 or 17% of those reported incidents had the EVA laws applied. So even though this law has been introduced, we can argue that it's whilst that law is beneficial, the fact that it's not necessarily being applied to even a majority of cases would mean that whilst the change is there, it's not really being accessed. And also 57% of girls are still married before they are 19. So yes, the minimum age is now 16, so that's not necessarily illegal. But what that means, if 57% of girls are married before 19, is that a lot of girls still aren't entering the workforce, because after they're married, they're usually expected to take care of family, have kids. It also means that a lot of them probably aren't gaining higher education or higher qualifications. And this is also demonstrated through the fact that girls continue to drop out of school in their later years, with only 27% of high school graduates being girls compared to 40% in primary. So we can see that there is a significant drop-off once girls start to enter high school. And that obviously can be correlated with that marriage age as well a little bit. And on top of that, girls' schools are still being attacked by insurgent and resistant groups. So 673 schools were bombed between 2007 and 2008. 453 of those schools are still closed in 2013. This, we could say, is a direct correlation with the changes that are occurring, a direct resistance to that change. And therefore, if you've got a resistance to change that is resulting in destruction and death, you could argue that that's not necessarily progressive or beneficial change overall. So, conclusions based on what I've shown you in terms of the beneficial changes or progressive changes that are occurring and the lack of access or the resistance to that. We could say overall that lack of access caused by powerful resistance to change, as well as just cultural lag that is kind of stopping girls and women from accessing a lot of the changes that are occurring to work, health and education. This means that changes for women have not been wholly progressive, especially for women in rural areas. So that was women. Now we're going to look at rural to urban migration, potential for benefit. Yes, there is some progressive change that we can see in that, but as with women, there's also that lack of access, resistance to change that is kind of limiting the extent of it being beneficial or progressive. So rural to urban shift is equals a greater diversification in work, which can be seen to be beneficial as individuals are given a greater opportunity for work, which means also potentially giving them greater opportunities for earning power. So we could say that this is beneficial as 85% of work was agricultural. However, about 5% of landowners held 45% of the country's most cultivated lands, which you would argue if the majority of your population is working in agricultural business, but only a small percentage of them actually own their land, then it's kind of keeping that wealth within their upper middle landowning class. And by diversifying the workforce, it gives the poorer middle class an opportunity to earn more and kind of have more control over their lives. So what this means, like I said, is it leads to a decrease in power and influence and lifestyle opportunities for a significant amount of Afghans' rural working class. Access to internet and technology is much greater in cities. So car ownership is up to 28 per 1,000 people, which is plus, and also 70% of persons in Kabul have access to reliable 24-hour electricity. Again, you could argue that this is beneficial or progressive change, as again, this leads to greater freedom of movement, as well as greater opportunities for expression and information. Access to schools is also greater in cities, thus the youth have far greater opportunities than their counterparts in rural areas and can gain higher levels of literacy, numeracy and employment, which again you could argue is beneficial change for especially those that are in these areas. However, there are significant cultural factors that limit the extent to which these changes are progressive for all those that migrate. What we're saying here is rural groups aren't necessarily benefiting from this change, so you could argue that there's not progressive change in rural areas, but there's a lot of progressive change in urban areas. But even those that are migrating to these urban areas aren't necessarily able to access all the changes that are occurring because of this significant cultural factors and cultural lag. So unemployment and poverty rates in cities is much higher due to lack of family support and government infrastructure. So 19% of youth were unemployed in 2014, which is twice the overall unemployment rate of the country, and 29% of people in Kabul live in poverty. So even with that migration and that greater access to opportunities and work, it's not necessarily available to all. And this comes back to that reliance on family ties to provide you with a job. So if your family doesn't have a proper connection with a business in those city areas, it's going to make it very difficult for you to get a job, which leads to this high unemployment rate and a high percentage of people living in cities in poverty. However, a highly significant factor of whether or not this change has been progressive is the loss of female significance within the family due to urban migration, especially for poor to middle class families. As we know, women's carpet weaving in rural areas creates an interdependence between the men and women of the family. They're able to make these carpets, which the family are then able to go and sell at the market, which provides women with in these rural areas with a significant important role in the family. Without this carpet weaving, it could have an massive economic impact on this family. So having that available to your family means that the women kind of have a larger role than just looking after their families. However, lack of access to wool in cities diminishes women's capacity to create carpets, which means that they're kind of losing that role as being somewhat of an economic contributor in their families. Additionally, women have little knowledge or interest in the work men do in cities, and many become rigidly aligned with domestic duties and are sometimes cut off from the meso and macro worlds because of this. So not only are they now not able to contribute to their family economically, they now don't have any real role in the family's business or family's money at all, which means that they're strictly domestic only, which has significant impacts on women's ability to interact with the meso-macro world. It also restricts freedom of movement to some extent, and some women, especially the middle class women, are worse off than what they were when they were in rural areas. Okay, so those are just two examples of where we would really argue that progressive changes occurred, so for women and urban centres, but even within these changes we can see mostly due to continuity of power structures and of cultural values and expectations. Change has not necessarily been that progressive.